What kind of unguided bomb lands 9 meters from the middle of a bridge pier? Not one dropped by dive-bombing math and a pilot's thumb. In 1967, standard planning figures for an iron bomb released in a 30-degree dive put the circular error somewhere around 300 feet, and commanders considered that acceptable. You sent 16 aircraft to guarantee 2 hits. Then, sometime in the last years of the war, North Vietnamese air defense staffs began writing down impact distances that made no sense against those figures. Averages under 30 feet, repeatedly, from aircraft that carried no guided weapons at all. If you want Cold War history with the numbers left in and the awkward parts intact, subscribe. Hit like. So the algorithm stops burying this stuff, and if you flew these missions or worked the intelligence side, put it in the comments. The primary sources are thinner than they should be, and first-hand accounts matter. The numbers came from an unlikely place. The assessments were written by people who had every reason to exaggerate American incompetence, not American precision. Political officers in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam's Air Defense Command produced damage reports meant to justify ammunition expenditure and request more guns. Reporting that the enemy hit exactly what he aimed at was bad career management. They reported it anyway. The captured material that reached American hands through the Combined Document Exploitation Center in Saigon is fragmentary and badly translated. Some of it survives only as English summaries of Vietnamese summaries of field reports. Distances appear in meters, sometimes converted to feet by a translator working fast, and the conversions occasionally disagree with each other on the same page. So treat the precise figures as approximate. The pattern, though, holds across multiple documents from separate regions. The gunners described a single aircraft, sometimes 2, approaching in level flight rather than a dive. No pop-up, no barrel roll into a delivery. It came in, released, and left, and the bombs went where the aircraft had been pointed. One assessment noted that this method reduced the time the aircraft spent in the engagement envelope of 37mm guns, which is correct, and it was the whole point. Nobody on the American side could immediately say which airplane it was. The F-105's reputation was built on speed and toughness, not delicacy, and the F-4 dropped bombs the old way, a sight reticle and hard-won instinct. Neither of them explained 30 feet. Ordnance analysts looking at bomb damage assessment photography saw the tight groupings and assumed guided munitions, then found no paveway kits in the loadout records. The answer was a subsonic single-seat light attack aircraft that Navy pilots had already nicknamed the SLUF, and the reason it worked had nothing to do with the pilot's hands. 871 sorties, 11 aircraft lost, 1 bridge, still standing. Those are the rolling thunder figures for the Thanh Hoa Bridge, the Dragon's Jaw, a rail and highway span over the Songma that absorbed years of American ordnance and kept carrying trains. The April 3, 1965 raid put 46 F-105s over it with bullpup missiles and 750-pound bombs. 2 didn't come home. The bridge took superficial damage and reopened. Nobody involved was incompetent. The arithmetic simply didn't work. Dive bombing worked like this. The pilot rolled in from perhaps 12,000 feet, established a dive angle he estimated by feel and horizon reference, held an airspeed he read off a needle, and put a fixed reticle on the target while sliding the aim point off to compensate for crosswind. Then he pressed the release at a specific altitude while pulling nothing, banking nothing, and being shot at by everything. Every one of those variables carried error. Dive angle off by 2 degrees, airspeed off by 15 knots, release altitude off by 200 feet, wind estimate off by 10 knots at altitude, and different at the surface. The errors didn't cancel. They stacked, and they stacked into the hundreds of feet that planning tables already assumed. Pilots called the wind correction Kentucky windage. It was exactly as scientific as it sounds. You looked at the smoke, the dust, the water, whatever the last man's bombs had done, and you moved the reticle an amount that came out of experience rather than mathematics. Good pilots were good at it. They were consistently better than terrible. The A-1 Skyraider proved the other half of the equation. VA-25 flew 30-degree dives at 250 feet and 280 knots, and that piston engine gave a slow, stable platform where the numbers stayed put long enough to matter. Slower meant more accurate. Slower also meant longer inside the envelope of a 37mm gun, which is a trade nobody enjoyed making. Sit in an F-105 cockpit on the run, and the sensory catalog is narrow and specific. Rubber and pure oxygen from the mask. Hydraulic fluid, always hydraulic fluid, warm and faintly sweet. Sweat pooling under the torso harness. Airframe noise through the canopy that flattens radio calls into mush. Somewhere in that, a man is meant to hold 2 degrees of dive angle by eye. Jack Broughton, who flew 102 missions over the North as deputy commander of the 355th, put the whole calculation in 7 words. We knew the odds. We flew anyway. That's admirable. It's also a terrible way to run an air campaign, and by 1967 the cost accounting was impossible to ignore. Each sortie against a hardened point target meant fuel, ordnance, tanker support, flak suppression, escort, rescue forces on alert, and a statistical fraction of an aircraft and pilot expended. Multiply by hundreds. Divide by one bridge that still worked. The Air Force answer became the laser-guided bomb, and it worked spectacularly. The Navy had a different idea already in production. Stop asking the pilot to solve the problem. Put an inertial platform, a Doppler radar, and a digital computer in the airplane. Let the machine know exactly where it was, how fast, in what attitude, and what the wind was doing. Then let it pick the release point. Grand Prairie, Texas, west of Dallas, 1963. Vought's engineering staff had spent the previous decade building the F-8 Crusader, a supersonic carrier fighter with a variable incidence wing and a reputation for killing pilots who got careless on approach. Now the Navy wanted something that shared the Crusader's basic shape and almost none of its ambitions. The requirement was for a light attack aircraft to replace the A-4, and the specification prioritized bomb load and range over speed. Vought's answer chopped the fuselage shorter, fattened it, deleted the afterburner, and fixed the wing in place. Subsonic, on purpose. In an era when every fighter brochure led with Mach numbers, Vought submitted an airplane that would never go supersonic in level flight and won the competition in February 1964 on the strength of what it could carry. The airframe numbers explain the trade-off. Empty weight around 19,000 pounds, maximum takeoff around 42,000, which leaves room for 15,000 pounds of ordnance on 8 stations. An F-105 hauled a comparable load and did it faster, and burned fuel at a rate that made tanker scheduling a permanent headache. The A-7 could fly a 700-mile radius on internal fuel and come back with something left. Sailors nicknamed it the SLUF, which stood for Short Little Ugly Fellow, or a less polite variant of the same idea. Nobody at Vought seems to have objected. The revolution came later, in the D&E models, and it had nothing to do with aerodynamics. Vought integrated an inertial measurement set, a Doppler radar that read ground speed and drift directly off the terrain below, a forward-looking radar for terrain and ranging, and an IBM digital computer designated the TC2. The computer matters more than any of the sensors. IBM was building flight computers for Gemini capsules in the same period, and the machine that went into the A-7 belonged to that world of core memory and hardened avionics, rather than to the analog bombing tables the Air Force had been using since Korea. The system worked like this. The inertial platform knew the aircraft's attitude and position. The Doppler set measured true ground speed and crab angle, which means the airplane knew the wind, not an estimate off smoke drift, an actual measured value updated continuously. The computer took those inputs, added ballistic coefficients for whatever bomb was hanging on which station, and calculated a release solution. Then it displayed that solution on a head-up display, a Marconi Elliott AVQ-7 built in Britain, projecting a bomb fall line and impact point onto the windscreen where the pilot was already looking. The pilot's job collapsed from solving a 6-variable problem under fire to flying the airplane and putting a symbol on a target. He didn't hold a dive angle or read an altimeter at release, and Kentucky windage stopped being a factor. He could deliver from level flight at 450 knots, which is exactly what the North Vietnamese gunners described. Straight in, release, gone, no theatrics. Average errors came in around 10 meters, from an iron bomb with no guidance kit whatsoever. Two things about this bother me. The first is that the Navy had a working solution in production, while the war ground through hundreds of sorties against single bridges, and the A-7E didn't reach combat until May 1970. The second is the Air Force. It ordered the A-7D, a Navy design, which for the service that had spent 15 years insisting on speed above everything represented a notable adjustment of principle. Those airplanes reached Korat in October 1972, 3 weeks before Linebacker II. The records I've seen don't say who inside Air Force procurement pushed hardest for the head-up display, and I'd like to know. What Vought built in Dallas was not glamorous. Nothing about a digital computer and a Doppler antenna makes for a good recruiting poster, and the airplane itself was ugly enough that its own pilots gave it a name based on that fact. But the engineering logic was correct, and the enemy's own paperwork proves it. The men behind those 37mm guns were measuring the output of a fire control problem solved in Texas by people who understood that the limiting factor in bombing accuracy had never been courage, 20 times per second. That's roughly how often the TC-2 recalculated the impact solution, feeding a fresh answer to the head-up display while the airplane moved. What the pilot saw through the glass was not a reticle. It was a line, the bomb fall line, running down from the flight path marker toward the bottom of the display, and a small circle or cross sitting on that line at the point where the ordnance would strike the ground if released at that instant. Move the stick and the symbol moved with it. A change in airspeed slid it along the line. It was a live answer to a question that had previously taken 4 seconds of a man's undivided attention while people shot at him. The procedure was dull on paper. Fly level at 450 knots. The computed impact point tracks across the terrain toward the target, and when the two coincide, you press the button. The computer had already accounted for altitude, ground speed, attitude, crab angle, the ballistic drag coefficient of the specific store, and the station it hung from. The sensory reality diverges sharply from the earlier generation. In an A-7E cockpit on a run, the cordite smell of the 20mm cannon isn't there yet, and the airframe isn't groaning through a pullout. There's cold conditioned air off the avionics bay, the faint ozone tang of powered electronics, green symbology floating on the windscreen against jungle, and the pilot's eyes never leaving the outside world. No head-down glance at the altimeter. Never looking inside the cockpit during the delivery was worth more than any aerodynamic improvement Vought could have bought. Below, a battery commander with 37mm guns had trained his crews on a predictable geometry. Aircraft roll in and descend, presenting a lengthening slant range and a solvable lead angle. Level flight release at high speed broke that. The aircraft never entered the part of the sky the gunners had rehearsed for. Navy documentation from the period lists the specified system accuracy for the A-7E as 10 mils. Whether squadrons routinely achieved it is a separate question, and the post-war assessments are inconsistent on that point. But the captured Vietnamese impact measurements sit right at the edge of the specification, which is a strange kind of validation to receive from the people you were bombing, who actually closed Haiphong Harbor, not the phantoms. On the morning of May 9, 1972, 6 A-7Es and 3 A-6 intruders launched off Coral Sea, ran in low across the water, and laid 36 Mark 52 mines in the main shipping channel at 8:59 local time, time to the minute against a presidential announcement in Washington. The channel averaged about 40 feet of depth and less in places, and 85% of North Vietnam's seaborne imports came through it. The deck that morning smelled the way carrier decks always smell before a big launch. JP-5, catapult steam, hot brake dust, and under all of it, a wind carrying the reek of the mine casings themselves. Nobody was shot down. The harbor stopped working. Then Linebacker opened, and the next day belonged to the fighter pilots. May 10th, 1972, MiGs launching. From Kep and Gia Lam, Randy Cunningham getting 3 in one flight, Steve Ritchie and Charles de Bellevue starting a run that would make de Bellevue the Air Force's first ace of the war that September. 11 MiGs claimed. Those are the stories, and fair enough. But while the air-to-air fight consumed the headlines and the wire copy, Navy attack squadrons were flying 2 and 3 cycles a day against the rail lines north of Haiphong, the Haiduang bridges, the transshipment yards, the pipeline crossings. Point targets. The kind that had eaten 871 sorties at Thanh Hoa and given nothing back. From inside the cockpit, one of those runs went like this. The airplane comes in low over the delta at 450 knots, wings level, and the pilot is not thinking about dive angle because there is no dive. Green symbology sits on the windscreen ahead of him. The impact cross-tracks up the rail embankment toward the bridge abutment, while the Doppler set reads the wind he never has to guess at. Below and ahead, 37mm batteries throw up a barrier they laid out for an airplane that would roll in and descend, and the tracer arcs go through empty sky. Cordite and burnt propellant from the 20mm come into the cockpit later, on the egress, mixed with the sour warmth of hydraulic fluid that every one of these jets leaked. The whole delivery lasts a handful of seconds. Cross meets abutment, thumb comes down, and 12 500-pound bombs walk into a span with a spread that a Vietnamese engineer battalion would measure the next day in single-digit meters. That is what Rolling Thunder could not do. The Dragon's Jaw finally came down in 1972, and the Air Force struck it with laser-guided bombs in May. And on October 6th, Navy A-7's off Saratoga went back with walleyes and put the western span in the river for good. Whether the bridge was already unusable before that strike is argued about in the post-war assessments, and I'm not going to pretend the record is clean on it. On one point, the record is not ambiguous at all. Rail traffic into Hanoi from the Chinese border dropped catastrophically through the summer. The word is from the American assessment, not mine. And Haiphong sat mined and idle for months, while a nation that ran on imported ammunition began doing arithmetic it did not like. 8 years of bombing had not produced that. 5 months of it did, and a large share of the work fell to a stubby subsonic airplane that its own pilots called ugly, flown by lieutenants who never made a magazine cover, carrying iron bombs that landed where an IBM computer said they would. A wooden range card, hand-ruled in pencil, marking slant ranges for a 37mm position covering a rail bridge. Those cards were built around dive bombers. Aircraft appears at altitude, rolls, descends along a predictable line, and the gun crew has an aiming solution they rehearsed 100 times. The A-7 arrived, and the card stopped working. It came in low, wings level, no roll-in to announce itself, at 450 knots. By the time a crew recognized the fat, blunt-nosed silhouette against the delta haze, the bombs were already gone, and the airplane was passing overhead in a shallow climb. The gun crews adjusted. The captured reporting, and I want to be careful because the translated material that reached American analysts is fragmentary, and the provenance of some of it is thin, describes an instruction moving up the chain and then back down. Identify this aircraft on approach. Do not attempt to fight it from a fixed position. Displace. Displace means abandon a surveyed, dug-in, sandbagged emplacement with prepared ammunition and pre-plotted ranges, and manhandle a 1,500-kilogram gun to a new spot where none of that exists. The crew fights worse, and the target it was protecting is now protected less well. The men on the guns sent that recommendation to their own superiors, in writing. The North Vietnamese air defense system, which had absorbed 8 years of bombing and killed something over 900 American aircraft and become the most sophisticated integrated air defense any nation had built outside Europe, concluded that against one specific subsonic attack aircraft, the correct response was to not be where the airplane was aiming. A battery commander in a revetment near Haiduang, ears still ringing, boots in 20 centimeters of muddy water, smelling burnt propellant and the sweet chemical stink of TNT residue drifting off a bridge abutment that no longer existed, wrote down that his guns should move before the next one came. They were not cowards, and they were not incompetent. They were professionals making an accurate technical assessment of a fire control problem they could not solve. One gunner's account in the American translation puts it as, "This one hits what it aims at." Vought's engineers in Grand Prairie never got that in a customer survey. It's the best review the airplane ever received. "Short little ugly fellow." That was the sanitized version, the one you could print in a squadron cruise book. Pilots who came out of Crusaders and Phantoms hated the A-7 for the same reason infantry hate a good pair of boots. It did the job and nobody wrote songs about it. It wouldn't go supersonic. It looked like a Crusader that had been left in a hot car. And the men who flew F-105s against the Dragon's Jaw in 1965, the generation Jack Broughton spoke for when he said, "We knew the odds, we flew anyway." Were doing arithmetic in their heads at 400 knots because nothing better existed yet. The world watched all of this on television in January 1991 and called it revolutionary. A single aircraft assigned a single target. A head-up display with a symbol showing where the ordnance goes. An inertial platform that knows the airplane's position without asking anybody. Crews briefed to hit one specific building and expected to hit it. The F-16's continuously computed impact point display is the direct descendant of the A-7's, refined and repackaged, and the design philosophy that put the answer on the windscreen instead of in the pilot's head started in Grand Prairie in 1963 with an IBM box and a Doppler set. The precision on display in 1991 was inherited. The A-7E got to see it. Two squadrons, VA-46 and VA-72, flew off USS John F. Kennedy in the Red Sea, the last A-7's the Navy would ever send to a war. They put standoff land attack missiles into Iraqi targets on the opening nights, hunted radars with harm, dropped iron bombs and walleyes, and flew something on the order of 700 combat sorties without losing an airplane to enemy fire. 26 years after Vought bid the design, the jet was doing exactly what its computer had been built to do, alongside F-117s whose entire reputation rested on the same principle. The airplane was older than most of the people arming it. Accounting. The Thanh Hoa Bridge, which absorbed 871 sorties and 11 aircraft, was repaired after the war and carries traffic today. The A-7's manufacturer became LTV, sold its aircraft business in 1992, and the Grand Prairie plant passed through Northrop and Carlisle and Vought aircraft industries before ending up inside Triumph Group. VA-46 and VA-72 came home from the Gulf and were disestablished in May 1991, both of them within weeks of each other. Surviving airframes went to Greece, Portugal, and Thailand. The Hellenic Air Force flew A-7Es out of Araxos until October 2014, which means Greek pilots were dropping bombs with a 1965 fire control concept while American squadrons flew Super Hornets. The gunners are harder to trace. The North Vietnamese anti-aircraft units that recommended displacing rather than fighting were absorbed into the post-war air defense force, and the men in them went home to a country with no imported ammunition problem anymore. Their reports sit in translation in American archives, cataloged, largely unread, and the names attached to most of them are unit designations rather than people. No mystery there. That's just how the material was collected. Nobody on the American side was interested in who wrote it. They wanted the numbers, last frame, and it isn't a bridge or a ceremony. It's the flight deck of Kennedy in the Red Sea, late February 1991, a hot steel deck stinking of JP5 and hydraulic fluid, and an A-7E rolling out of the arresting gear with its hook dragging sparks and half its stores gone. A yellow shirt waves it forward. The pilot climbs down, sweat-soaked, ears ringing, and hands his kneeboard card to a maintenance chief, who is already thumbing a grease pencil to write up a gun jam. Ordnance crews start rolling 500-pounders out of the magazine elevator for the next cycle. The pilot walks to the dirty shirt wardroom, where they are serving sliders and bug juice, and eats.